For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Good evening, I'm Surya Gangadharan. This time we are focusing on a series to mark the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We are looking at the impact on Europe, the political, economic, and strategic impact on Europe in particular. And I have as my guest this evening Velina Tchakarova of the AIES think tank in Vienna. You've met her before. Velina, welcome. Glad to have you again.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back.
Velina, I understand there is another campaign, a Russian campaign getting underway in Ukraine. What can you tell us about this?
Well, according to the military experts, no matter whether it's the Western ones or those who are locally based, Russia is preparing for a big military offensive. That makes perfect sense. It's ahead of the first anniversary. It has stabilized the front lines. It has, let's say, introduced a hybrid form of warfare by practically air bombing the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. And now it needs also a military victory, specifically in the Donbas region. That means in Luhansk and in Donetsk. In Donetsk, still around 40% is not under Russian control. So it's very important from not just a symbolic point of view.
So, is there anything beyond what they've already achieved that they are going to try and settle this time around?
Oh, absolutely. The goals of Russia in this war haven't changed much. Let's be clear about it. Of course, tactically, the goals have been shifted. And as I said, Donbass is the immediate priority. Of course, establishing a so-called sanitaire cordon around Crimea. That means preventing a successful military counteroffensive by Ukraine, most likely in Zaporizhia, as anticipated, but also stabilizing the front lines in Kherson so that Crimea is protected. This is the next immediate military goal. The ultimate goals in this war remain the same. That means political, economic, societal subjugation of Ukraine is still very much on the agenda. It's just that we will probably see a different way of how Russia will try to achieve this. Russia will seek to trigger a tipping point in the critical infrastructure of Ukraine by this partially successful bombardments. They will continue. We will see probably a huge number of them, drones, missiles, and so on. So this is going to continue. The idea of installing a puppet government, that means a Russian-friendly government, is still very much on the agenda, even though that, as we saw, it failed. And of course, you need to understand it's not just about the territory or just about the natural resources that Russia still controls now, with the 17% of Ukraine that are under Moscow's control. It's more on the agenda, and that is that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, it will continue pursuing its goals in Eastern Europe, and that is to create a new European security order, a European security order that is, of course, favorable to the Russian geopolitical interests.
You know, Velina, Russia, from the reports we read, has suffered tremendous losses in men and material. So yet it seems they have vast reserves to draw upon. Is it accurate?
Well, both is true. The numbers are even higher, most likely, than anticipated, because, as we know, Russia traditionally doesn't reveal numbers of casualties and injured in its wars. But Russia has also started adapting to the realities on the ground. So despite the obvious signs of stress, I argue that these mass mobilization waves will continue. So we have seen already the first one, where Russia could actually more or less sent around 150 to 200,000 reserve troops to the front lines, to stabilize the front lines, to actually pursue a defense rather than offense strategy in this stalemate phase of the war. But I argue that we will see further mobilization, mass mobilization, so to say, according to the law of numbers. So a lot of these reserve forces will be thrown into the war as cannon fodder, because you need to understand that material and human costs do not play a role in Russia's way of waging war. So we will see more of that. And of course, Russia wants quantitatively to win the war, because Ukraine is obviously in the worst position regarding the numbers.
And you don't see any signs of anti-war kind of sentiment building up in Russia, even within the administration.
Well, of course, it very much depends on this critical phase of the war. There is still a scenario in which, if Russia does not, let's say, mark any significant military gains, it doesn't succeed, let's say, in controlling the whole of Donbass and so on. So the next 3 to 6 months will show that. We may see some sort of conflict within the Kremlin, but you should understand that this war has been planned and has been orchestrated not by the military sitting in Moscow, but by the KGB and the closest circles around Putin. These are the so-called Siloviki. So this dividing line between the St. Petersburg, let's say, circle around Putin, and the military personnel, the intellectuals also, is very much existent. I actually anticipate that in the case of, let's say, devastating results for Russia in the next phase of the war, we may see political change, but it will come only and solely from the closest circles of Putin. And then, of course, what we may see is a kind of political vacuum and struggle for power, much worse than what we saw in the 90s.
And okay, which brings me to my next question. Germany and some other countries in Europe, even the US, are sending tanks to Ukraine. There's even talk of fighter aircraft being sent. Where is all this leading? I mean, first of all, I want to look at how practical these displays of support are, and second, is it going to lead to a wider war?
Okay, I will start with the second question, because the answer is much shorter, and that is that did we see actually a wider war or a wider military confrontation during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the Americans were in fact sending weapons and all of the equipment and ammunition to various wars and conflicts? We didn't see that, and I actually anticipate that this is not going to be the case now either. Why? Because neither the United States nor Russia, and in fact also China, are interested in any direct military confrontation. Now, we may hear, of course, Putin referring to NATO, Russia, military conflict, but this is important for him to actually justify the war, and it's more or less meant for internal consumption, also very importantly meant for international consumption, because Russia relies on international partners to break the isolation from the West. And I argue actually that it has been done quite of a successful job in that matter. Now, going back to the second question, is that none of these international partners, including the European ones, are part of the war just because they are sending weapons and ammunition and so on, because according to the Charter of the United Nations, Article 51, if a country is actually attacked, militarily attacked, and there is no doubt about it because the General Assembly voted on that, and the majority of all countries actually in the world voted that this is clearly the case. So there is no disagreement internationally in any circles around the world. And let me remind you what Modi said, that this is not a time for war. This is not the era for war, right? The Chinese president also was quite discontent about the ongoing war. So there is no disagreement about the fact that there is an aggressor and then there is an attacked country. So just by providing the weapons, this doesn't make them automatically or turn them automatically into war party. The problem is a very different one, and that is the problem that within these countries, the population hasn't seen a war since the end of the Second World War.
Second World War,
except
yeah.
for the Yugoslav wars. But the Yugoslav wars after the collapse of the of Yugoslavia were perceived as periphery, somewhere far, far away from the borders. So you need to understand that this is a psychological problem. It has a lot to do with the strategic culture of some of these countries, specifically Germany, of course, where pacifism has been the motto for the last 60 to 70 years. And this is actually now the big problem for the decision makers, how to justify this and explain this to their own population instead of, trying to convince someone else internationally.
Mhm. So, do you see a divide within Europe and also between Europe and the US?
I don't define it as a divide. What I see is an emerging bifurcation of Europe. Let me explain what do I mean by that. When it comes to security guarantees and protection from external threats, the United States is still perceived as the sole state actor. At least that is the case in various parts of Europe. Take the example of the Nordic countries now with this unprecedented move by Sweden and Finland to join NATO. Take the Central Eastern European countries with few exceptions, for instance, Hungary. So there is this common shared perception. The United States needs to remain engaged in Europe. And the United States is the only security guarantor for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of these countries, and by extension, of course, NATO, because once United States is still present, NATO will be also active. Now, as you probably know, we have also the Franco-German bloc trying to more or less amplify and actually accelerate the European integration. That means we have also the whole debate about Zeitenwende, which is this epochal change, turning point in European security and defense policy, with many new initiatives, with the debate on strategic autonomy and sovereignty. And here is, if you like, this emerging dividing line, that is that France and Germany, as the leader of this Franco-German / European integration of security and defense, has very different perception and very different view. First, on Russia. Over the last 25 years, Russia first policy, that was actually the more or less the agenda by the European Union and also by countries like France and Germany. And then, of course, the approach to China, the next unanswered question. They actually still think that they can normalize the relations, that they have that they can have trade and economic relationship. So here is the dividing line based on future geopolitical and geoeconomic unanswered questions, where the CE countries, the Nordic countries, probably will go along with the what I call Anglosphere, with the UK and with the United States. And then, of course, what we will also observe, depending on the way how Ukraine will perform, if Ukraine is, let's say, through a political bloc with Poland, accepted into the European Union, and this European integration is, speeded up as a process, we will have also this power shift within the European institutions, within the European initiatives, where a very big CE bloc will suddenly impact all of these developments. And the eastern flank will be the new, if you like, iron curtain. Let's say more or less an iron curtain in a metaphorical way, because Russia will not give up. And somehow Ukraine has to has to be integrated into transatlantic structures because of its very own survival.
Gosh. Also, this issue of energy, do you see that as now a dividing factor, or has Europe been able to largely overcome that issue?
Well, let's be honest, Europe was very, very lucky. But the question is, how long can you actually place your existential geopolitical and geoeconomic policies at the mercy of nature? What do I mean is, of course, the mild winter. Second important factor was that more or less Europe reduced its demand to 15%. And third important factor was that United States increased the share of LNG to the European countries. I mean, it increased almost by 100%, and it still cannot cover the whole of the European gas demand. Still, there are volumes missing, so that opens the question: what comes next? How will the European Union and the European states manage to diversify away from Russia, which has been let's say, the biggest commodity supplier to the old continent? Still, we are, of course, competing with everyone else on the global markets. And that was also one of the reasons why we were lucky. And that sounds very, very cynical, but in reality, because the European states could afford themselves these high prices, they actually took away also some of the volume of energy from other countries that were not able to afford themselves such high prices. This is, of course, also an issue. So short term, the issue was, let's say, solved. Mid to long term, we are still in troubles.
So, is there any mass discontent that you see developing?
Well, of course, every time when there are socioeconomic issues, like everyone else in the world, that is not a unique phenomenon only in Europe. You see, of course, the rise of certain populist movements and forces, be it on the right or on the left of the spectrum. This is going to happen once again. We see how, for instance, the migration card is being played once again by certain political forces to score domestic points. We see that these socioeconomic repercussions from the pandemic, coupled with the looming energy crisis, even prior to the war that started on February 24th and then amplified by the war, are still quite present and strongly felt, even though that, of course, the European Union institutions and the European governments had a lot of instruments, fiscal instruments, economic trade, so a lot of geoeconomic instruments to mitigate the effects. And yet I think that it will very much depend, in fact, on the way how politics communicates with the people, how politics explains things to people. Because, for instance, still, of course, these populist forces are using certain narratives in order, like I said, to score in short term when it comes to elections. So yes, once again, now with the war continuing in the second year, and I don't see an end of this war in 2023, we may see some political surprises in one or other country. And let's not forget that Europe is under complete information warfare. That is being very successfully, by the way, conducted, thanks to the fact that technologies nowadays enable state actors to do the unimaginable as compared, let's say, to the period of the Cold War. So cheap tools with a huge impact, right? And the population is not protected. We, let's say, have forgotten what it means, to tackle certain issues. So this together will put Europe under some pressure in the coming months.
So I just want to get back to an earlier question about the supply of tanks and possibly even fighter jets by Europe to Ukraine. What do the military people around you tell you, is this going to make a material difference to Ukraine's fight against the Russians? Does it help in any way? Is it token?
Yes, every actually heavy weapon system and equipment, ammunition, everything will help Ukraine. We know for sure that Ukraine would have lost the war if it had not been for the United States in the first phase, because the Americans were the, let's say, the quickest, and they started supplying, and then Europe, which was lagging behind,
Yeah.
started also supplying. So this is a fact. Ukraine needs everything it can get from the West, because this is the absolute reality. So the technical side of the question is, let's say, twofold, because some military experts think that it's not going to be a game changer because of the numbers. Yet again, the other side of the coin is that for instance, the tanks are also critical for the Ukrainian troops to be deployed successfully without big losses, because more or less that they are absolutely unprotected in large parts of the terrain, where successful air bombardment is still very much the case on the Russian side. So here it is it is, like I said, a twofold issue. But will we see the military jets? Of course, this is something that is now the big debate here in Europe. The UK gave some positive signals. Yet again, I expect that it has to be a coordinated way, because most of the countries are still kind of cautious to not send the wrong message. Now, the wrong message, what would be? I think that right now, and it goes back to this bifurcation also of Europe, that there is this, let's say, a kind of division in the way how the West looks at the outlook of the war. And that means that there is no strategic agreement on the question whether Ukraine should be militarily supported only to the extent that it can actually sustain attacks from Russia, or should Ukraine receive enough military support to win against Russia on Ukrainian territory? We don't have an answer to this question, and it goes very much back to the question of the supply of tanks and military jets.
So, what does Ukraine want? Does it want to recover all the lost territories? It believes it can do so.
Yes, if you listen to the military intelligence of Ukraine, if you listen to the Ukrainian army, if you listen to the political elite, they are still very much convinced that Russia has already lost the war. In a sense, I mean, it's not just about the first several important phases of the war. I'm not going back to go back to that, because we have already a lot of information. But in fact, they still pursue the maximum goal, which is to push away the Russian troops from the whole of the territory. So in this phase, they are also preparing for a military counteroffensive. According to the experts, it is anticipated to take place in Zaporizhia, and then also to try to close, to seal off the south. So they are preparing, but they also are pointing to the readiness to conduct a next stage of military offensive in the direction of Crimea, depending on the way how this phase turns out, in which direction, what kind of outcome it will have, and so on and so forth. So yes, absolutely, the maximum goal is to regain complete territorial integrity in its 1991 borders.
So, really, there is no end in sight to this war. I mean, we could see this stretch on, possibly through this year, maybe even longer.
Well, if you take a look at the goals of the two parties, yes, they are absolutely diametrically opposed. And that means that for the moment, there is zero incentive on both sides to engage in any kind of negotiations or peace talks. Now, we know, of course, for sure that there are some efforts coming from outside, like it was the case with Turkey and the UN initiative, the grain initiative. Now, for instance, the Chinese foreign minister wants to travel to European states and then to go to Moscow to communicate also with Moscow what he has actually discussed with European partners. But once again, there is no international, let's say, mediator that will be able to bring these two war parties to the negotiation table, because both are convinced and believe that the options that they have right now with continuing the war are better options than the option of stopping the war. For Ukraine, this war is still, let's say, for Ukraine, the options are still between continuing the war or actually complete subjugation, because Ukraine knows very well the moment when it stops, the war, it will be run over. Russia, of course, had different options. Russia had the options of between short war and long war, and we saw that Moscow failed in the first option. So now it has, so to say, adapted to the realities and has prepared for the long war. So once again, of course, even if there are some kind of negotiations, there will be under Russian conditions, and that means at least those territories. And these territories are not, 17% is 1/5 of Ukraine. Ukraine is the second largest European country. These territories are rich of natural resources, not just fossil fuels, but the minerals which are critical for the green transition. These are billions of dollars of investments for the future. And of course, they would put also Russia in a very different geostrategic position in the Black Sea. So if we say, I mean, these are just 17%, I want our viewers and listeners to understand that this is a very different dimension of, taking over a small country, which, like it was the case with Georgia or Transnistria, the Transnistrian conflict, where there are Russian troops on the ground.
So, last question, Velina. You think Europe has the stomach for such a long war with really no end in sight?
I'm not sure about it. In fact, if you ask me when I'm traveling to the European capitals, I cannot say that each European state shares the same sense of urgency about the issue. I don't see anywhere or in the most places, except for those neighbors, direct neighbors of Russia, preparedness and preparations for instance, for the military industrial complex, where this kind of orders, not just for Ukraine but for the sake of their own defense, have been placed, where the political decision makers have made it clear that they will back these orders because the industry needs a green light. So I wouldn't say there is still this kind of, like I said, this kind of oscillating between unclear goals and political decision making in Europe, and specifically in this democratic framework, is very different because it is narrowed down to a very, very short period of time, where you have probably as a politician 2 to 3 years maximum window of opportunity to act. So nobody is inclined into taking strategic decisions or into taking risky decisions, which will cost the political career. So we are in this phase, and we should also, of course, be a little bit honest about the fact that, and I argue that the politicians will never admit it openly, which goes back to the issue that I mentioned with communication, with strategic communication. Decision makers here in Europe have to clearly communicate that wars are also being waged by other means, because when people hear war, they only think about tanks and military jets. But Russia has in fact successfully waged a non-kinetic war against the European security order. What do I mean by that? Weaponization of commodities, dependencies, which, by the way, has been a self-inflicted pain
Yeah.
coming from some of these countries. They decided to not diversify. And of course, Moscow used this. So weaponization of fossil fuels, of fertilizers, of food commodities. But then again, also the nuclear blackmail issue, where there is no clear actually indication of any preparations on behalf of Russia that Moscow would use nuclear weapons. But the nuclear blackmail, that means the threat of using nuclear weapons, functions because people are scared, and then they are pressuring their governments to act against it. How to? By proposing, for instance, negotiations. The information warfare is in full mode, and the citizens are not prepared for it. So that means that they are reacting to certain disinformation campaigns, to propaganda on a daily basis, and they do not understand even that they are actually an object, not a subject, but an object of this warfare. So all of these non-kinetic, warfare modes are, currently ongoing, and I would say quite successfully, because Russia in the end needs probably one major country
Yeah.
to fall down politically. It tried with Italy, because one of the coalition partners under the Draghi government, in fact, wasn't satisfied with the Russia policy, so the
Yeah.
government had to step down. And it is enough to have one big player within the European Union family, and then things may look very differently when it comes to the support, the continuous support for Ukraine. Because, like I said, international isolation is not the case. The weaponization of different, non-kinetic warfare tools is also successful. And the only important dimension that remains is, in fact, the Western continuous support for Ukraine. If that fails, Ukraine will be left alone, more or less, and will not be able
Yeah.
to defend itself.
So what we're actually seeing is total war of every kind. It's not just on the battlefield in
Absolutely.
Ukraine, it's every other
Absolutely.
manner.
But you need to understand that from Russian point of view, Ukraine is not the only goal in this war. The way I see it is that Russia wants to position itself in the upcoming systemic conflict between the United States and China. It wants to get the pole position. It wants to become this indispensable player in a new systemic conflict, because Russia understands that it's not going to be this systemic player like it was during the Cold War, but it
Yeah.
can become a wild card. It can become a game changer. It can become
Spoiler.
a spoiler, and this is only possible if Moscow closes the chapter on Eastern Europe, if Russia successfully destroys the status quo from the last 30 years, if Russia establishes control over, like I said, the second largest European country, has power projection in the Black Sea, in the Eastern European region, and then from there, of course, it can also project vertically towards the Middle East, African countries, where it has already started growing its presence. And the ultimate goal is also an access, of course, to the Indian Ocean, and then getting actually connected to other partners like India. So here we have very, very different, agenda than
Yeah.
just the tactical one, which I think is very much overlooked by most of the European decision makers, which see this war only as a local war that is only
Yeah, it
between
isn't.
Russia and Ukraine.
It's huge. Yeah. It's huge. It's huge. Great perspective, Velina. Thank you very much. We're completely out of time. But as always, it's great listening to you. And we look forward to more such interactions going forward in your independent avatar.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Always a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Velina. Thanks very much. And for those of you following us on this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media and Instagram. And just a reminder, we have a couple more segments of our Russia series coming up. So do tune in just every evening. Thank you and good night.